Hello readers, I'm Amy and today we're gonna have a little discussion about To Kill a Mockingbird. This video is entirely my opinion, discussions that I have had with people, so feel free to comment down below with your own thoughts. But yes, this is my copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm actually going to unhaul it for reasons, but we'll go ahead and remember to actually set a book back here when I'm talking about it. Not that you can really see it from this distance, but whatever. Ignore this plastic that you see in the corner here. This is one of my little plant nurseries that I've set up, and there's not much space for it to go in this room. Anyways, let's get started. To Kill a Mockingbird. I think the way I'm going to talk about this is talk about some of the background for this video idea, how I got the video idea, what I think of To Kill a Mockingbird, and my own experiences with it. Then I did tweet out for opinions on To Kill a Mockingbird and people's different experiences or different thoughts on To Kill a Mockingbird, so I will discuss those. And then I will end the video with discussions that I've had with people who are teachers or who are very familiar with the school systems and how that is set up and how this whole thing got a lot more complicated than I thought. But anyways, welcome to my little discussion video. So I actually want to start this with, I want to say it was the year that I started my BookTube channel. I want to say it was 2019. PBS did a Great American Read thing for like a whole summer where you got to vote on America's most popular book, and I believe it was a list of 100 books. If I can find the video again, I will link it down below. It was really interesting to see America's reading tastes like all come together in this list, because it was something you could vote on like on a daily basis. I'm not sure how I feel about daily basis voting. I feel like it would have been more accurate to just do the one time per person voting, but whatever. The number one book, even in, assuming it was 2019, was To Kill a Mockingbird. And I was thinking, why? Like, it's an older classic. I don't know how relevant it really is anymore, which I'll get into that in a minute. But it struck me and it was interesting. And then several weeks ago now, if I remember correctly, Victoria, from what Victoria read, had tagged me in her school days book tag. So you're going through different times of the day and you're going through different classes and answering questions about them. And one of her questions was for an English class, what books would you like to see being taught in an English class? And rather than jumping in with, I think these books should be taught in an English class, I jumped in with, I don't think To Kill a Mockingbird should be taught in English classes. And I will link that video wherever the thing in the corner is supposed to be. I keep losing track. And I basically go on this whole big rant about how I don't like To Kill a Mockingbird as a book. I don't like that it's still this popular that almost everyone has to read it, or almost everyone has read it. Like, there's just other books that I think we should be reading. This is a classic book. It is about a black man who's on trial. It's from the perspective of the young white daughter of the black man's lawyer. So it's very much a white perspective on mid-1900s racism. It's written by a white author, and that's the part that really gets me. For all of our talk these days about reading diversely, diverse characters, diverse authors, this is the book that we still consider the best book in American literature, or at least the people who voted on the Great American Read still consider that one of the best, most popular, most amazing books in literature. It was written by a white woman about race, and that gets me. Besides that fact, I was really bored with it in high school. Most of the people that I knew in high school when we read it were bored with it, did not find it all that interesting. It wasn't until I read it as an adult that I really understood the nuances of what was going on, which I was in like a regular English class. I wasn't in AP English or anything. We didn't have a ton of English class options. Again, gonna get to that later when I talk about the school system. But that was basically my opinion, my discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird. Also, whenever I get to Twitter opinions, which I'm going to do now, and some of the school stuff I'm going to talk about later, I will also talk about some of the comments that I got on that video that I thought were really interesting. So, to start out with my tweet here, it says, "All right, everybody, I need opinions. I think that To Kill a Mockingbird should no longer be taught in schools. For a video, what are your thoughts? Retweets appreciated." So I'm going to read off either most of these or like ones that aren't, that like generalize some of the comments that were on here. One person says, "I read it on my own, not for school, and really loved it and thought it was great. I don't know the context in which it is taught in schools, but I can imagine it's used to open important conversations on racism, as well as writing interesting characters and plots, so I don't see an issue." It's been a while since I've read the book, and studying in school, in high school, I don't remember a ton about it, but I do know that in my school, which had little less than 100 kids graduating in my class, I don't remember talking about racism. I don't remember it. If I did, it was brief. I believe To Kill a Mockingbird I think the way I learned it was more about the life of this young girl and like how she relates to her dad being a lawyer and her adventures with was it her brother and her friend? Again, it's been a little while since I've read this. And I remember there being a lot of talk about symbolism. They were really heavy on symbolism in my high school. They beat symbolism into you, beating a dead horse. Just, you had to know what symbolism was, and that was the only important thing. I don't remember having conversations about race with my white teachers and my white classmates when reading To Kill a Mockingbird. It just wasn't a conversation that stands out in my mind as us having. Another person says, "I studied it in school and have read it again since, enjoyed it so much both times. I think it definitely had important teachings about racism, and I think it should continue to be taught. It was definitely well handled at my school." I don't know where this person went to school. I'm glad that they felt it was well handled. I don't think it was well handled at my school. Again, it's a book about racism, but I don't remember us talking about race. That's gotta be significant. This one is interesting. This person's from Belgium. It says, "As its current use, no. In Belgium, they use it to illustrate masterful writing, but there are thousands of works that would fit better. But if they would ever have the balls to teach about racism and have a discussion about literature, it would be fuel for discussion, I think." I feel like I really relate to this person's experience. I also think at least in my country, don't know how it is elsewhere, current taught literature works should be modernized. They're still forcing us to read it for its beauty among other problematic works, while modern literature is starting to take a stand. I was at senior year of high school, the junior year English class switched over to reading The Help, which is still not a great book to be teaching in class. Like, I enjoyed it, but it's also got this white savior discussion that I don't think my school was having with that book. It's not, I think, a book you should necessarily be reading in schools when you're going to talk about racism. So I definitely agree with this person, like, at least in the way it's currently being used. And this goes into a whole other discussion on classics. Why are classics considered classics? Why do we think that we should have read all of the classics? Like, I've got this whole shelf of classics. I haven't even read half of them. I don't think I'm going to read more than a quarter of the ones that I haven't read yet. Like, why do I have all these classics? I don't know. I don't love most classic writing. It's not always the most accessible form of writing, and I do think that there's a lot more modern books that have better conversations, that have better characters, that have better plots. A lot of classics, I think we read them just because they were good for their time, which isn't to say that they're all still good now. That would be a whole other video that I don't know that I can have because I haven't read like a ton of classics, but I know there's other channels that I think have had this conversation. This person says, I agree, the author had no business writing a white savior story, and I'm extremely uncomfortable with all teachers that teach it using the N-word so carelessly. Also did not have the N-word used in my classes when talking about it, that I remember, but I think I would remember that, because I always knew you didn't say that. That's a big thing. If you're a white teacher who's using that word, even in teaching a class, that makes me nervous. Coming from a white person's perspective, though, so take that with a grain of salt. I personally enjoyed the book, but felt very uncomfortable reading it in school, as the teacher would have us all read passages aloud, and kids would say the N-word, and the teacher didn't say anything, and people just laughed. Definitely needs nuance while it's taught, and there was none. Again, agreed. There's not a lot of nuance. Like, I didn't have those conversations in high school. There's one person who says, why would you think that it's a classic? Like I just said, classics would be a whole other discussion. Most of these are all in a similar vein. This one says, I think if it's gonna be taught, teach it alongside a book by a Black authored book and discuss the difference in representation and why it matters. That would be an awesome lesson that I think would give you a lot more well-rounded view of the book and its point in history and the changes that have been made. Got taught in year 10 in Sweden, and I cannot agree more. It should not be part of any curriculum anymore. There are other better books that handle the same issue in better ways. And then this last one that I'm going to read out, I read this book in school 18 years ago. I think it should be taught in schools as it shows us the history of what Black people went through, but also shows us that we are all equal and should be treated the same regardless of race. But they should also start to teach books by people of color too. This one really reads to me as someone who is colorblind. I used to be that way in high school. It was a white, I grew up in a very, very white religious town. I had this idea that, like, I didn't see race, everyone's equal, all of that. Now, I'm at the point in my life where I do see race, because there are those differences between us, and there are those ethnic differences between us, and those are important because those inform how we live our lives. And as much as I would like everyone to be equal, that's not the way it is now. And I think it should be taught in schools as it shows us the history of what Black people went through. Does it, though? If it's written by a white author, does it really tell the history of Black people? Hint, hint, that is going to be a video when I get around to that project. I think that's a fascinating discussion. But I would say no. It's written by a white author who had no experience being a Black person. It was the mid-1900s, so I feel like you only had access to so much information on that. This comment makes me uncomfortable. I feel like this person should have a discussion with themselves about colorblindness. But anyways, those are the tweet replies. I kind of went on that for a while, but I think it was interesting. Some people agreed, some people disagreed. And for the most part, it seems like people agree that there should at least be some nuance to the conversation that is missing. All right, on to my YouTube video that I was talking about where I ranted about To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'm going to read out a couple of the comments. This one I'll go ahead and say names because the people that I'm going to talk about have BookTube channels themselves, and I think they bring up really interesting points. Shannon from 155 Books says, yes to teaching modern and interesting books in school. I think that teaching only classics is one of the reasons why so many people ended up hating reading for fun. Agreed. I know so many people who don't read, who hate reading, who think it's boring, and a lot of that I think has to do with the way that we're taught in high school. Classics are the important ones. They're the ones that got us started, and it doesn't really seem to matter where we're at now. It matters where we started whenever you're in school. That's great if you're trying to teach the start of things, but you also need to teach the evolution of things. And I don't think we're really taught about the evolution of writing and perspectives when we're taught in English classes, which Again, I'm going to talk about this more whenever I get to the school discussion, but I would definitely agree with that. And then Victoria, from what Victoria read, says To Kill a Mockingbird gets taught a lot at year 9, which is age 14. She's in England, because it's just so ingrained in the curriculum. And as I'm learning, that is something that is frustratingly slow to change. It can also be because schools have to provide a copy for each student to read, and a lot of schools, at least here in the UK, already have that resource, and money for new books is scarce. That is another interesting point that I didn't consider. Like, yeah, if you have to read a certain book in school, it's usually a book that the school already has access to, that I already bought copies of. They're usually older, beaten up copies, which brings you into this whole discussion of schools that are underfunded and schools that are in poorer neighborhoods that have less funding than other schools, and what they might have access to. It's a whole new level that I didn't think about before getting that comment, which is why I look for opening up conversations like this, because I'm able to get these new perspectives on things, because there's a lot of stuff when I'm talking about something in the moment, I forget a lot of things. There's a lot of things that I don't consider or think about, and then I'll get a comment and I'm like, oh, I should have brought that into account. So, quick discussion on school systems. I have been through school. Clearly, I have been through America's education system in a couple of different forms, but I am not particularly educated on the way schools work. And that's not something that I did a ton of research on. I don't really have time to put too much research into my videos. I want more of like casual discussion, things I've learned from other people sort of videos for now. But one of my very good friends has, I want to say one of her parents was like a chemistry teacher and one was a librarian, I think. Anyways, she's very familiar with the school system. So, kind of set the stage here. I grew up in Montana. I still live in Montana. That is in the northern part of the US. Some people apparently think I live in Canada, which is not true. Montana is one of the 50 states, because there are, in fact, 50 states. There's a backstory to that little bit of snark. Anyways, I grew up in a town of like 5,000 people, and when I graduated, my graduating class was 96 people, including myself. Looking at today's population for her town in Montana, it's not quite to 10,000, so it's about double the population, or actually that was back in 2019. Anyways, that gives you an idea. Her town was a little bigger, but it's Montana. I don't think of Montana as particularly progressive in almost any way. But I don't know if you are familiar with the grade of your school. That would be something that I would be interested in knowing down in the comments. But I was always told that my high school was an A school. Like, that's what we were. We were an A school. And I thought, oh, A, B, C, D, F. Like, we're an A school. Cool. We're the best. Awesome. We had good sports teams. Like, we were an A school. And I'm talking to my friend about this discussion with, like, To Kill a Mockingbird and everything. And she's like, well, I went to a 4A high school. And I'm like, you can do better than an A? I assumed that the school system grading was the same as like my school grades, my paper grades. I'm like, you went to a 4A school? What does that even mean? So my class, I don't know for sure because I didn't take AP English, but I think each grade of my class, or at least the junior and senior grades, had English as well as AP English, and that was kind of it. That's what we had. I thought that's what everyone had. No. I can't remember all the classes she said she had, but she had English, there was AP English, there was Japanese literature. Who takes a Japanese literature class in high school? Because I didn't have that opportunity. That was not something offered to me. There's also, when I think about Montana and then I think about like San Francisco, my particular town had this interesting system of there was one grade, or like one of each grade, K through 12, and each school taught certain grades. You had one school that did kindergartners, first graders, and second graders, another school that did third and fourth, one that did fifth and sixth, one that did seventh and eighth, and one that did 9 through 12. And that was it. There was one school for each because of our lower population. And in a place like San Francisco, you could have, I don't know, throwing a number out there, you have hundreds of schools for thousands, possibly millions of different students. I assume that those schools maybe have a little more leeway, a little more diversity to them, but I'm still kind of assuming that everyone in America had to read To Kill a Mockingbird. And reading the Twitter comments, it's like, well, I didn't actually have to read it for school. And I'm like, really? You lucky duck. You lucky duck. You had options that I did not have. And like Victoria was saying, it could have to do with financial resources and access to that. Shannon was saying that it could have to do with us like having to know the classics, and for whatever reason this became like a well-known classic. But I'm seeing all these other experiences of people in similar sized towns or in bigger towns are like, no, I didn't have to read that. My curriculum was great. I had all of this diversity thrown in there. It was awesome. I'm like, I was told that I grew up in an A school system, and it's really starting to feel more like an F. And obviously, I don't understand that part of the school system at all. It's not something that I have really learned about. But again, an interesting conversation to have. I would like to go ahead and finish off this video with a couple of recommendations of my own. I was talking to Victoria earlier today because she does teach in England, and I'm not entirely sure how the English school system works. She talked a little bit about it. She said it's a really complex topic. Besides To Kill a Mockingbird, Of Mice and Men is another quite controversial text that we study with our year 9s, and most schools will either do that one or To Kill a Mockingbird. She said that the government sets the curriculum, but schools have some choice over which text they use. So for her class for years 10 and 11, instead of reading Othello, they're reading Macbeth. I don't know if she has a list of options to choose from, or if she gets to find something on like a similar topic, but different schools are going to have different kinds of curriculums available to them. Something that she would recommend is she'd rather teach something from a BIPOC author, like Passing by Nella Larson or one of the Angie Thomas novels. I have not read any of those. Angie Thomas I haven't read because so far she's been a YA author. That's not a genre that I usually reach for. I would like to read The Hate You Give eventually, but not really putting a time limit on that. Passing is one that I've heard so much about lately. I really want to pick it up. I have so many book projects going on right now, and I don't know when I will pick it up, but the goal is to read Passing by the end of the year, because until like 6 months ago, I didn't even know that it existed. I'd never heard about it. I didn't know that there was this book that was over 100 years old that was written just on the topic of race. Like, I didn't know, and I think it's awesome, and I think it's astounding that I had no idea. Maybe not that is astounding, considering some of the things that I learned in my white school system were more than questionable. But anyways, some books that I think could maybe be better. One of these, if you want to get into, I'll start with classics and go into more moderns. Classics, Passing is probably one that you should read. Like I said, I haven't read it. I'm gonna read it. I'm really interested to see what that's about. I've heard lately, so this is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I loved this book. It's just kind of going through this person's life. It's talking about like a hurricane that happens. It's so good. And I'd actually learned recently that while I consider Zora Neale Hurston a pretty well-known classic author, she wasn't actually discovered as a classic author until fairly recently. Like, she was just one of those underappreciated authors, and someone found her and they're like, oh, she does great work, and now their eyes are watching God as a classic. I loved this book. I would love to see this taught in schools. This was just phenomenal writing. I really want to read this again soon. I've been feeling like doing some rereads lately, so whenever my book projects like calm down a little bit, I want to dive into this again for a reread. Another classic that we could do, so this one's more modern. It doesn't really talk about slavery perspectives. If you want more of a slavery perspective, there is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. This is talking about the incidents in the life of a slave girl. So these are two classics that I think could replace To Kill a Mockingbird, because people of color can have stories written by people of color. Astounding. Just saying. And two modern books that I would like to see taught, rather than something like The Help, which again, I enjoyed, but it's got this white savior complex thing going on, and I enjoyed it, but I also think maybe we shouldn't be teaching that in schools. The Vanishing Half is one that I read recently. It talks about twins who grow up in this town that is all mixed race, and if people know that you are from that town, they're like, oh, I'm not really gonna serve you or give you my time because you're black. And that's it. Even though they're mixed race, it's a little more complex than that. And you have these twins run off from the town, and one lives the life of a white person and one lives the life of a black person. And we're largely following the perspective of the daughter of the twin who's living as a black person. And that conversation was so interesting. I did a video on this mentioning this, where I talked about how I don't really see colorism talked about a lot. And someone did comment on that, like, as a white person, you don't see colorism talked about that much. And the commenter was Latinx, and they're like, colorism is a huge part of my life. And again, that's something I didn't think about. I'm a white woman. I don't hear a lot about colorism in my experience. And reading this book was so eye-opening. I loved hearing about these different perspectives, or their different lives, and how they were viewed. And this just got cut off because my battery got tired of recording me. But anyways, hopefully you didn't miss out on too much of that conversation. I think this would be an amazing book to teach, especially having grown up in the society that I grew up in. It's just not something that we talked about. It's not something that we learned about. I think it's an incredibly important conversation before you become an adult, before you become more set in your ways and your opinions. Like, we should be teaching this kind of stuff at a young age and opening people's minds from the get-go. Something else to mention with The Vanishing Half is it does have a great conversation on gender. I don't really want to give it away, but there's this person, gender is a pretty big part of their life, and usually when discussing that topic, books have this big reveal where, oh, everyone finds out about this person's gender and it's this big deal, but this book didn't have that. The gender difference was just there. It was just a part of the story. There wasn't a big drama around it. There wasn't a big reveal around it. It was just there. It existed. And I would love to see that more in books that we're teaching to this younger audience, because I was only used to seeing gender as this big reveal, but to see it just exist casually in a book, that's amazing, and we need to do that more often. Gender doesn't have to be this big surprise, this drama. It can just exist, and that should be okay. So if you want something with more of a literary fiction perspective, I would recommend Girl, Woman, Other. This would definitely be harder to read. I would do it for like an AP English class, but it's more literary fiction. It has a ton of different perspectives, and it's written in a way that I've never seen before. I wouldn't call it a novel in verse, but it's not really a regular novel either. There's like, you can kind of see it with this page. There's all these page breaks, and it's kind of like moments in the life and snippets of the life of these different characters, and they intertwine a little bit. I wouldn't say they're hugely involved in each other's lives, but they do come together, and it's an interesting book. I think it's the first one also in this pile that I mentioned that is not an American book, which is fine because we should be reading books from other countries, which reminds me of an author that I want to point out, not necessarily a book. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She has come out as having some more problematic views because she agrees with J.K. Rowling, but still an important author to read when talking about feminism. I read her We Should All Be Feminists speech. I haven't read Half of a Yellow Sun yet. I think the one that I hear about most from her is Americana. Haven't read her yet. Started this book once and was not in the mood at the time, but she is an African author. Her books I know go more into African history and racism and feminism, and I think that would be another just really important author to read, another really important book to read. So definitely maybe try introducing this author to some classes instead of To Kill a Mockingbird. So, this was a very long, rambly video. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Please leave all of your thoughts down below. This is such an interesting conversation to have. I love hearing people's different perspectives on whether or not they had to read this book, what they thought of it, if they didn't have to read it, all of that. So, please like, subscribe, and be my friend on social media. I will see all of you in my next video. Bye, friends.